I was 13 years old when I started wrestling with this question. What if God would why couldn't he just, why won't he just? Whatever you put in that blank, it could be personal, it could be painful, it could be very specific to your need, it could be very general to the needs of the world. I don't know. But I know at age 13 what I was wrestling with, what I was dealing with. See, I was raised in the church. My grandfather was a minister. I knew all the Bible verses. I could quote them. I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew what I was not supposed to do. I could tell you word for word why Jesus came, what he did, why he did it. But every night, for most of my 13-year-old experience, I would go to bed. Most of my friends were believers, had a Christian mom. People had done everything they could to make sure that I was surrounded by faith, by people filled with faith. I would go to bed, and I would pray a prayer that went something like this. God, if you're real, if I really do have faith that changes, if I have a home in heaven, if, why don't I feel like it? God, I need you to send me a feeling. Some of you, it's not a feeling you're looking for. See, I'm a very emotional human. I like emotions, and so I work off of emotions, and I needed God to give me an emotion to confirm what he had done in me. That's what I thought I needed. Some of you, you're more physical. You like to see it, to feel it, to touch it, and we're actually going to read about an individual who needed physical proof. Some of you, you're more spiritual. You don't need physical proof. You don't need emotional proof. You need a sign. You need the skies to open, a miracle to happen, and that's what it would take for you. If God would just reveal himself by some miracle, by some sign. And what really was going on in my heart for about 9 months, every night, I must have prayed 1,000 times. No answer, no nothing. I just went to bed torn and wrestling. The problem was this. I wanted God to make sense of it before I really believed it and embraced it. I wanted it to make sense on this side before I fully committed and trusted and saw it on the other side, because I was scared of what that could mean and what that would look like. For most of my teenage existence, I wrestled and fought with doubt and fear. And to this day, I have moments of doubt. I have moments of fear. I'd love to tell you that in those moments I embrace who God is and what he can do, but sometimes I don't. And the truth of the matter is I'm not alone. Most of the early followers of Jesus, including the apostles, were men filled with fear and doubt. And I'd like to read to you this morning from the book of John about one individual who is known for his doubt. Read with me in John chapter 20. We will be there in just a second. Before we read it, I want to remind you what was going on in the hearts and lives of these guys. We'll be in John chapter 20 and verse 24. Before where this passage picks up, Jesus has died and they all abandoned him. Okay? Every last one of them, except for John, abandoned him and turned their back. And Peter even turns his back when he said he wouldn't. And Jesus dies lonely on a tree. But 3 days later, he arose from the grave and he revealed himself to most, not all, of the apostles. There were 10 of them there. Judas has now killed himself. And Thomas isn't there. We don't know why. He reveals himself to them and he says, I am who I said that I was. Now remember, the apostles didn't fully embrace and understand who he was. They thought he was there to raise up a physical kingdom. He was never there to do that. He was there to raise up a spiritual kingdom that went beyond borders, that wasn't known by limitations of geography or physical presence. He wanted to start something different. So Now they began to embrace it and understand it. They went and told Thomas. They said, Thomas, we've seen him. He's alive. Thomas wasn't there. He didn't see him. I want you to read verse 24 with me. And Thomas, I don't think that's right on the screen. Yes, verse 24. We need to go back a slide. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came, verse 24. Verse 25, the other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. What Thomas was asking, if God would just reveal himself to me, if Jesus would show himself to me, I would believe. But otherwise, I will not. And here's why. Because to Thomas, we weren't talking about saying, I believe in Jesus and I'll go to church. He wasn't saying, I'll believe in Jesus and I'll read my Bible. He knew that if he was going to believe in this, it was going to be life-changing because it already changed his life. He had given up everything to follow this guy. And if this guy was not who he said he was, he'd already wasted 2 years and he wasn't about to waste the rest of his life. So he said, if I'm going to believe this, I've got to know it's true. Now, Thomas and I are not the same exactly because he didn't need an emotional feeling. He needed a physical presence. Read on. Read verse 26. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Thomas says, if God doesn't, I won't. And 8 days pass. I wonder what those 8 days were like. Seeing Peter, seeing John, seeing all of these guys who say they've seen Jesus, he's no longer dead. And you've said, I will not believe. I want to give Thomas credit for a couple of things, and this is what I want to encourage you with. You may be here this morning, and you're filled with doubt. You have a lot of questions, you have a lot of doubt, and you are not sure about this faith thing. I will say this about Thomas. Even in his doubt, he surrounded himself by people with great faith. He continued to gather with the other disciples. This is true in every area of your life. If you have self-doubt in any particular area of your life, it is good to be around people who will encourage you, who will mentor you, and who will build up your faith. This is especially true in your spiritual life. When you are struggling with doubt, when you are struggling with fear, it is good to surround yourself with people who will build you up, not people who will just say, well, believe, buddy. You got to believe. That's not what I'm talking about. People who understand you're not going to just believe. It's going to take some time. There's going to be some wrestling. There's got to be some patience. When I was 13 years old, I had an individual who was in my life. I didn't have a dad growing up, but I had a lot of guys in my life, guys at the church, my uncles, and they were patient with me, and they didn't just try to push it down my throat. They said, Mark, we understand it's hard. You're just going to have to work through this on your own. There's nothing we can say. There's nothing we can do, but we're here for you. That's what I'm talking about. And for those 8 days, Peter could describe it 100 times. It wouldn't matter. John could eloquently tell him the tale of his best friend Jesus. Jesus and John were closest of anybody. But it wouldn't matter. Thomas was struggling, and he said, I need to have this confirmed. Notice verse 26, the latter part. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. It's very important that we understand what Jesus says, when he says it, and why he says it. These are very afraid men. The doors are locked because they are wanted men. They've killed Jesus, the rulers have, and they're not afraid to kill these guys as well. He says, don't be afraid. Peace be unto you. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it in my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing. This isn't the idea of don't just be an unbeliever. This is the idea of a continuing sense. The Greek language makes it clear. He's saying, Thomas, don't embrace this momentary lapse in your faith. Don't allow this momentary lapse to turn into a lifestyle pattern where you are a big-time doubter of all things good, of anything good in your life. Be a believer. Be one who embraces belief, and to the point where people know you not as a doubter, but a believer. I want to remind you Thomas gets a very bad rap. This is one of the only 2 recorded instances we have of Thomas. The other one, he was very brave. He literally said, if we die, we die. Let's go with Jesus. That's what he said. But that's not what we remember him for, is it? Oh, no. We remember him for his momentary lapse of faith. Let me encourage you. Doubt doesn't have to turn into unbelief. Doubt doesn't have to rob you of your faith. It will come and it will go. You will deal with it. It is a tension that comes and stays sometimes. It's how we embrace it and if we allow it to rob us of our faith. That's what matters. So Jesus says, Thomas, I want you to be a believer, not an unbeliever. In verse 28, Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Now, we read the Bible, and that just like flows right by us. He said, my Lord and my God. But we miss it, right? This is the first time one of the apostles says to Jesus, my Lord and my God. He's signifying, I'm there. I know what it means. I'm not just believing you came back from the dead. I'm believing you are the Lord and you are my God. You are the Son. You are the Messiah. You are the one come to save us from ourselves. I believe it. And with that statement, he's saying, I am all in. We miss it because our language needs so many words to say things, and their language needs just so few. He said, my Lord and my God. And notice what Jesus said. Jesus answered him, Thomas, and this is harsh, but it's true. Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. Within 100 years, millions of people would believe in a Jesus they never saw physically, though they were on the earth maybe even at the same time as him. Within thousands of years, billions of people have believed in a man they've never seen to be the Son of God, to have died and come back from the dead. And here this morning, many of us, we believe that he is real, he is who he said he was, and he did what he did, and we never saw. And Jesus said to Thomas, your faith is small in comparison to the faith of those who will believe, who will never get to see me. Now that did something to Thomas. It struck him in a good way. It wasn't condescending. Jesus was reminding him, you have a great opportunity. The book of Acts records for us how the church grew in Jerusalem, how it went to Antioch, Rome, and around that part of the world. But scriptures do not record for us what happened to Thomas specifically. However, church history has done a fairly good job of recording for us, not the specifics, but we do know what happened to him. Thomas was a changed man after this. He went to India, he began reaching people, and estimates have millions of people who were converted in the first 100 years to Christianity in India because Thomas went there. Now, he did die there. He gave his life reaching people thousands of miles away from the little part of the world he was born and raised in. And here's my question for you this morning. If God would just do, if God would just heal, if God would just answer, if God would just reveal, here's my question to you. What if he doesn't? What if he doesn't? He did for Thomas. He did. I'm going to remind you, God does a lot of things one time. Part the Red Sea, that was a one-time thing. Walking on water, one-time thing. Feeding 5,000 on that hillside, he did that once. Turning water into wine, once. You know why? Because it was never about the miracle and how cool that was, and we can do that over and over. It was about showing who he was. What we want sometimes, we want somebody else's miracle, we want somebody else's prayer, we want somebody else's relationship with God, and that's not going to cut it because we're not them and they're not us. I'm not Moses. I'm not getting a burning bush in the desert, and neither are you. You know why God did the burning bush once? You know why God did the water to wine? You know why God did this for Thomas? Because they didn't have this. They didn't. Moses didn't have any of it. Thomas had the Old Testament. He didn't have the New Testament. He didn't know how this whole thing was going to work out. He was going on what he saw at the moment. And I'm going to tell you something. As much as some of us like to believe if we could see Jesus physically one time, we'd believe the rest of our lives. I have to tell you, we're good at convincing ourselves we didn't see what we saw. There are thousands of people who saw Jesus physically and turned away and said, nope. There are many who followed him before he died and rose again and never came back. Let's not fool ourselves into believing that if God would just, we would. I'm going to tell you something, and it's going to make you a little uncomfortable. Sometimes God won't. And that's a hard pill to swallow. And here's my question to you. What are you going to do if God doesn't? Believer, what are you going to do if God doesn't? Is that going to wreck your faith? Is that going to shake your belief? Is that going to alter how much you believe, how much you're willing to get involved, how much you're willing to trust him? Because it shouldn't. And here's what I mean. What if Jesus didn't reveal himself to Thomas? What if he really wanted to see, man, what would happen if I didn't? Thomas would have never fully embraced who he was. He would have never traveled the world and changed a portion of the world that he had never been to. I'm telling you, in the realm of eternity, all this time, Thomas has no regrets. But what if he had held true and Jesus didn't, and so he didn't? Would that be worth it? I don't know the answer in your heart, but what I'm hoping I can help you understand is this. It's not. It's not worth it. And so this morning I want to ask you, as we get started with this series, we're going to wrestle with this question over the next couple of weeks. But the first question we've got to answer is this. Not if God would just, but what if he doesn't? Because that shows a lot of who we are and where we are and what we're willing to believe and not believe. I told you about when I was 13, what it came down to. It was a Thursday evening. I was with a bunch of my friends. We went to this youth conference, and it was the craziest thing. It's a youth conference, and they had this, I got to be careful how I say this. He was an older gentleman. He was not at all relevant to what I was doing in life or thinking in life or how I didn't know anything about teenagers. I don't remember a thing he said. To be real honest with you, I don't remember being too impressed. And I don't mean that condescendingly. I just mean like he was not connecting. It wasn't some guy got up there with charisma and convinced me to believe in God. That didn't happen. Far from it. But in that evening, we read some passages, Romans and John. And God began to speak to me, not even through the preacher or the message. And God said to me, why do you struggle so much? You need this feeling. You need this feeling. Feelings don't last. I've told you what you need. I've given you so much here. You can see the life change that has happened in people around you. You keep looking for a feeling. Feelings come and go. I'm eternal. You just need to embrace it and believe it, whether or not there's a feeling. And it finally made sense here. It made great sense up here, okay? I understood confession, repentance, faith, belief, justification. I knew all those things. I could talk you in circles through the Bible. I knew it here. Never here. And so on June 24th, 1999, it went from here to here. And a crazy thing happened. I felt something. Not some heebie-jeebie floating in the sky stuff, okay? None of that. Nothing crazy, just I felt assurance, relief, and belief like never before because I was willing to say, I'm going to believe and embrace regardless of what happens. This is what I know to be. This is what I know to be true, and this is what I'm going to risk my life for. This is what I believe is the truth. And it happened. It's not to say I don't struggle with doubt and faith since then, but I've never wrestled with, is God real? Does he love me? Do I have a home in heaven? Those questions, they don't affect this brain or heart of mine anymore. And that's where God wants to get us. That's where he got Thomas. That's where he wants to get you. So over the next couple of weeks, I want to talk about what it would take for God to reveal himself. If God would just give me a sign. If God would just fix my problems. If God would just, we're going to talk about all those because we need to. We need to address why is it sometimes that we pray and nothing happens? Why is it sometimes that other people seem to have great faith and things come about because they pray or because they believe, but it doesn't happen for me? We need to talk about that, and we're going to. But we need to start right here with this question. If God would just, but what if he doesn't? What would that do to your faith, believer? What would that do to your questions? This morning, I believe God has. He has done whatever you can fill in the blank there. You say, I need him to reveal. He did reveal himself to hundreds of witnesses who wrote down their records, who wrote down their accounts, and we have an account here. It revolutionized human history. There's no way around it. There's no doubt about it. He has revealed himself. If he would just right all the wrongs. You know, God rights wrongs, but there are a lot of wrongs because we are wrong. We do wrong things. We like to blame God for what people do to one another, forgetting that we are people who sometimes do awful things to one another. What we want is we want God to remove free will from the equation, and he will not. He gave humans the right to choose right or wrong, and as long as there's a right to choose, people will do awful things. Now, sometimes those wrongs will be righted, but we do not live in a perfect world. That is gone. We live in a world that is dealing with the reality of who we are. We want to blame God, but it's who we are that we hate and we don't like to see. This is not the way God intended this world to be at all. He created a place with no sickness, no death, no animals turning on each other, no humans turning on animals or one another. None of that existed until we decided we just got to know. Maybe there's more than this. And there is. There's much more than that. We just never anticipated what it looked like. What is it that you need God to do to reveal himself to you? What is it that it would take for you to believe? I don't know your situation. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be answered in a 6-week sermon series. It wasn't for me. I'm not going to tell you to just try harder, believe more, have better faith. I'm going to tell you this. Thomas kept surrounding himself with other believers. He kept showing up, and he kept wrestling. That's the pattern, that's the step, that's the way you need to wrestle with your faith. Surround yourself with people who believe. Surround yourself with people who will encourage you, and keep showing up. Because one day you're going to show up, and there it's going to be. I didn't show up to that youth conference and find music that I liked. It wasn't even the music I liked. I didn't show up to that conference and find a charismatic leader who just swooed and swayed and said the right thing. It didn't happen. I showed up that night, and God revealed himself to me in a way that has changed my life. I'm glad in the midst of those 9 months, my mom kept taking me to church. I kept going to youth group, and people kept encouraging me. I don't know where you are on this faith journey. You might be in the area of doubt. You might be in a state of complete unbelief. Or maybe you're a believer who's just struggling. I don't know where you are, but I want to encourage you this morning. What would it take for God to reveal himself to you in a way that would strengthen your faith? And what would it take if he did not do, or if he allowed to happen to you, that would wreck your faith? We need to be honest with what that means and what that looks like and what that says about us. Don't place your faith in actions. Don't place your faith in things that happen to you or around you. There's something bigger at work here. If God would just. Last one. If God would just, what? What? You'd believe? You'd fully commit? You'd fully engage? You'd forgive them? That's where I'm at sometimes. If God would just wreck their life, I'd forgive them for what they did to me. if God would just, what will you do? Because here's what Thomas said, and we're done. He said, if God would just, I'll believe. Not, I'll believe, I guess, maybe I'll get baptized and, I'll go to church sometime. No. If he does, I'm all in. I'm all in. What would that look like for you? Let's pray.